thank you again for agreeing to be a guest. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit about Vince Davis, who aren't familiar with him or his background. Vince Davis has 4 decades of diverse experience in emergency crisis management and business continuity. He has served in numerous roles in the U.S. military, government, disaster relief, and corporate environments, and currently serves as the Director of Disaster Services for Feeding America, and is the founder president of Preparedness Matters, LLC. Vince, before we get started, is there anything else that you'd like to share with the audience today?
No, except that I'm a proud grandfather of 8 and great-grandfather of 1. And I've been around way too long, but I actually started in this business when I was very young. So,
all right. Well, thank you for sharing that. It's a great legacy to be building. You know, when I first met you, it was at the International Crisis Management Conference back in 2018. And you presented on Defeating the Clown, Community Resilience in the New Normal. Can you share a little bit with this audience about that presentation and the points that you were trying to drive home?
Sure, Ashley. What I was trying to impart at that time was that the idea of community resilience was just then taking hold. People were talking about resilience and what it meant. The theme, Defeating the Clown, referred to the blow-up dolls that we used to have as children back in my day, that you would sit on the floor and you would punch them and they would go down to the floor and they'd bounce back up because they were full of air. And Defeating the Clown, was the theme of Defeating the Clown was, how do you define and really quantify what resilience means? So one of the first things I wanted to impart was the idea that resilience is not a thing. It's a series of activities that go into helping a community or an organization bounce back from whatever kind of adversity that it might encounter. I talked about 6 steps, and some of those steps, to elaborate just a little bit, were the idea that we've been used to a top-down approach to community preparedness and to business preparedness even, where we say this is what we're doing and everybody else should fall in line. Well, that hasn't worked. The other part is that we need to change the message. And the message now is, if you don't prepare, don't worry about it. Somebody else will take care of it. If you don't prepare, we'll be here to save you. And we need to change that message to be very pointed in our understanding by the public and by the stakeholders that we serve in businesses and corporations, that nobody's going to save you. You have to save yourselves, and you have to prepare to save yourselves. So those were some of the major themes that I tried to impart in Defeating the Clown. And then finally, how do you create a resilient community where you can actually quantify what success looks like? In emergency management for so many years, and I've been such a big part of this at FEMA and at Red Cross and other organizations, we like to talk about preparedness, but nobody wants to measure what it really means. Preparedness in my mind is how many people are trained in CPR and first aid in your organization or your community. How many community stakeholders have disaster plans? How many practice exercises and training regularly? We seem reluctant sometimes as a community to put these quantifications on our work because we don't want to see it as failure if we think we're not measuring up. But we really have to be honest with ourselves and say, if you can't measure it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'm remembering why that talk resonated so strongly with me. And, we both have a background in working in the public and the private sectors, and you just referenced, some of that experience. Can you share a little bit about what has been most rewarding for you in, each of those areas?
Yeah, I think in the public realm, certainly the work that I'm doing now with my Preparedness Matters organization is really close to my heart. In 2012, I wrote a book called Lost and Turned Out, a guide to preparing underserved communities for disaster. And my intent of the book was to point out how we need to demystify the disaster process for the average person, because the average person doesn't, or when I say the average person, I mean people who are not in emergency management or business continuity or crisis management, often have no idea what this really looks like from the insider's point of view. But one of the things that I learned at that juncture in my career was there was a woman who was filming a documentary called Cooked. It was the story of the 1995 heat wave in Chicago, where 700 people died in a week due to excessive heat before anybody even realized that many people were dying. And the premise of the documentary was that it was death by zip code. Almost all of the people who died were elderly. They were African American. They lived in some of the poorest communities in Chicago. And at that time, the filmmaker and I got into a great dialogue about these issues. And she said to me, "Well, Vince, don't you think hunger is a disaster? Don't you think hunger should be treated like a hurricane or a tornado? Shouldn't there be a FEMA declaration for hunger? Shouldn't there be a FEMA declaration for poverty, for homelessness?" And I said, "Nah, I think you're mixing apples and grapefruit. I really don't think these things are related." And I gave her some very, very vociferous arguments as to why these were unrelated. Well, guess what? I could not have been more wrong. They're all related. And now 12 years later, I had the pleasure of working with her on an organizational project here in Chicago called Blacks in Green, doing green climate communities. And I had to first of all, apologize to her for my ignorance and thank her for enlightening me that all of these things are related. So my work at Feeding America at least in the nonprofit sector has been the most rewarding, or is the most rewarding at this point, because I'm able to attack all of these issues as similar issues rather than as separate issues. On the corporate side, probably my biggest accomplishment is the work that we did at Walgreens. When I went to Walgreens in 2011, myself and 3 other people, emergency management, business continuity folks, were hired at the same time. We started on the same day. This was at the behest of Walgreens Board of Directors, which at that time ordered them to fix their business continuity problem. And the problem was 8,600 stores, 23 distribution facilities, dozens of corporate offices, no disaster plans of any kind, no business continuity plans or programs of any kind. So we were walked into an empty room and literally told, "Fix this." It took us 4 years, but we built what has become a world-class disaster management and business continuity program at Walgreens. 2012 won the Rick Riscola Award for the best private sector disaster program from Homeland Security for our work during Superstorm Sandy, in which we stood up in 24-hour EOC to manage the outage of 2,200 stores across 7 states. So that's the work I'm most proud of. It took us 4 years to build it. We all left, moved on to bigger and better things. But as I look back, it shaped all of the work that I did subsequent to that at Sony, where I did a similar role of building a framework around a disaster and emergency management program. And also at Amazon Corporate, where I did disaster planning for Amazon's corporate offices in Seattle.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. Really diverse experiences, but it seems like you've had some great ones in coming in and building things from scratch, which is daunting. But like you said, it seems like it's so rewarding at the end of it. So tell me a little bit, because you're now the Director of Disaster Services at Feeding America, and based on what you were saying just a few minutes ago, you joined them in 2020, I believe. What has that experience been like for you, and what do you do in that role?
Yeah, I started after the pandemic. So unbeknownst to a lot of people, and actually to me before I started here, Feeding America is a member-based organization with 200 food banks in its network. It started off as America's Second Harvest, evolved over years into a really sophisticated network of food banks that serve 68,000 or so what we call agencies, which are food pantries around the United States. The biggest single organization that does feeding both in blue sky and gray sky in the United States. We've of course come into very sharp focus during the last couple of years during the pandemic. Prior to COVID-19, we were feeding approximately 37 million people a year who were food insecure. Since the pandemic, that number has, of course, gone through the roof in terms of people in need of food who never, to that point, even knew that a food bank existed or what it was. But our mission as Feeding America is not just to feed people, but it's to end hunger in the United States. So in order to do that, we must diversify our portfolio and really go into areas that previous to now, people might say, well, that's not your area. Just go feed people and be happy with that. So we're doing a lot of really great collaborations with organizations who are doing other things that are tied to feeding and food insecurity, but not necessarily directly related. For example, we're doing a program now called Natives Prepared. We're piloting a program with Native communities in the United States to deal with the twin issues of food insecurity on tribal lands and disaster literacy. Why not? Because the two are related. If you were food insecure before a disaster, you're going to be more food insecure after a disaster. So how do we prepare people to be both disaster literate and disaster prepared, and also help the tribes become food sovereign, which is their goal. Their goal is to be able to produce and provide their own food for people. They don't want somebody coming, handing them food and saying, here, we're doing you a favor. So working on projects like that. But then more of the traditional stuff. So what do I do at Feeding America? As disaster services, I report to the executive director of disaster services, who's been at the organization for 15 years, basically doing what I do as a lone entity. He was he was it. And I marvel at the remarkable job that he's done over these years before I ever got here, and wonder how he actually did it, because it's a lot. We've got, whether you believe it's the climate change or the zombie apocalypse, the reality is that we are facing enormous disasters every day. This week alone, I've dealt with flooding in Arizona, Mississippi, Dallas, Texas. Again, record flooding in those places, Kentucky a few weeks ago, so forth and so on. That is the new normal that we live in. Disasters happen everywhere all the time. There is no flood season. There is no hurricane season, no tornado season. It's all things are in play. And so we deal with those issues every day. We monitor and support the network by monitoring weather events and other events around the country on a regular basis. And then working with the food banks to make sure that A, they are able to continue their operations after a disaster occurs, and B, that they have the support from the network to continue to provide food for the people that they serve, both pre-disaster and post-disaster. The uniqueness of our organization is that we deal with the daily disaster of food insecurity all the time. So we don't have to gear up per se when there's an earthquake, a flood, a fire, or et cetera. We are already in disaster mode all the time. We just have to, switch gears and work with the nuances of continuing to provide food for the people who are affected by the event.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about that because it's been, on my mind quite a bit. in the crisis management space as we're looking at the severe weather that you just mentioned, not only here in the US, but also looking at the EU and other parts of the world. China has experienced a massive drought this year as well. Thinking about the war in Ukraine and how that's changing the dynamics in terms of, the provision of food there. And so I've been thinking a lot about the likelihood of food shortages. So it seems like Feeding America is very uniquely poised to provide guidance and hopefully support in that area. But what's your take on that? What are you guys preparing for, and what are you thinking is likely to happen as you're talking about, the challenges that people are facing every day right now in terms of food shortages? And, it's making me think like just that extra bump, right, of a disaster of that magnitude where you magnify the number of people with food insecurity. What are you guys thinking about that right now?
Well, exactly, Ashley. I'm glad you asked that question. There are a number of organizations that work in this space. The World Food Organization, World Central Kitchen, others who deal with the same issues that Feeding America deals with in the U.S. that are dealing with food insecurity issues on the world stage, and that is no small task. Obviously, we're pretty much. We being Feeding America, pretty much confining our efforts to the United States at this point, but we certainly work through and with best practices by and through those organizations that are doing food that are dealing with food insecurity on a world stage. The issues are the same. The populations differ. But there are issues of poverty that go on before the disaster. There are issues of people with disabilities, people with limited mobility. There are issues of equity and diversity in both the administration of those programs and certainly the providing of feeding services. So it becomes or it behooves us to not necessarily think of food insecurity as a United States issue, but as a world issue. Mm. And the fact that we even are having this discussion, or that Feeding America exists within the wealthiest nation in the world, is sort of a paradox in and of itself. How could we have trouble feeding people in a country that has as many resources as we have? So if you take that and you overlay that premise over a country where 90% of the residents live in poverty and live in really objectionable conditions, you can imagine what that's like in terms of just trying to get food to people. It's been a problem for years. It's going to become more of a problem as we work our way through the increased number of incidents that are occurring because of climate change or the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah. So. And then I was thinking, you're just referencing the flooding in Texas and Arizona. I've been watching the heat waves and now the flooding that's happening across the country here in the US. And just thinking of the situation in Texas that I became alerted to, of the farmers and the ranchers there, losing crops, right, at a massive scale, as well as losing livestock, basically. And thinking of the downstream effects of what that's going to cause to the population as a whole, and especially those who are most vulnerable and have the least resources. But thinking from your experience in emergency management from the corporate side, what recommendations might you give to those of us resilience professionals out there trying to, at the end of the day, safeguard our employees and protect our organizations? I've started to raise thoughts to organizations about, what if your employees can't get food, right? Not everyone is on the higher pay scale and has the most resources. Would we open up our cafeterias and provide free lunches? Or, what would we do if we are faced with those disasters where there is food insecurity? Are there any partnerships they could form with organizations like yours or others? Just generally, what would you recommend that we should be thinking about in terms of preparedness and response?
Well, I think there's two things, and I'm glad you focused on that question. I've long been an advocate of the barber's kids never have a haircut. I've worked for some of the most iconic corporations in the world, like Amazon and Sony and Walgreens, and those companies are made up of employees, people, all of whom are not at the higher pay scale. Many of whom are struggling just to make ends meet and get by. And I think employers are somewhat, to some extent, obligated to care for those people. I think that short-sightedness certainly showed itself during the pandemic, because most companies weren't prepared at all for 100% of their employees not to be at work. They just weren't.
Yeah.
And it's really quite uncanny, because I was digging through some files the other day on a thumb drive that I had, and I went back to a 2014 pandemic plan that I wrote when I was at Walgreens. And I was just reading through some of the premises there, and one of them was, how do we care for our employees? So very important. So I think the lesson, if there's many lessons that come out of the pandemic, it's, without people, you don't have a company. We, employers need to start taking stock of, how they're treating their employees, both during blue sky and certainly during disasters. One of the things I worked on a little bit when I was at Amazon, for example, was an employee sort of CERT program to prepare employees in Seattle for the inevitable earthquake that is coming. Because again, those are the people who are going to actually need to show up to continue the business of the company. And if they're not taken care of, and their families are not taken care of, you don't have a company. I did some benchmarking with a number of companies in Seattle. There are a bunch of very large employers in the Seattle area that I joined. I actually formed a group with some others to work on that issue of workplace and workforce resiliency. Okay,
Right.
Companies like Boeing and Nordstrom's and T-Mobile and others in the Seattle area, Microsoft, joined together to talk about those issues on a regular basis and see if we could come up with processes and programs that would better address the needs of employees in a disaster, and not just having an occasional event where we talk about getting a disaster kit and all that good stuff. I'm the anti-disaster kit guy, but really narrowing it down into disaster literacy and making sure that people understand the real risks involved in where they live. A lot of people moved, for example, to Seattle, unbeknownst to them, because they work in accounting or HR or whatever else they do, that they were moving to one of the most prolific earthquake zones in the world. That they were sitting right on the potential of a 9.0 Cascadia earthquake in Seattle. And they had no idea that, that even existed there, that the possibility of an earthquake of such devastating proportions that it would literally cut off the Pacific Northwest from the rest of the country was a completely foreign concept to them.
Or a super volcano. Yeah.
Right. Or super volcano. Yeah. And they were shocked to hear about it. They were like, what? Really?
Yeah.
I had no idea. I was just going along fat and happy, going to work every day, taking my little commute to work and looking at the beautiful mountains. And you mean to tell me we're sitting on a major earthquake? And I'm like, yeah, that's what I mean to tell you. And you need to be aware of it. So a lot of it is awareness. People are much more mobile than they used to be. But so employees and companies are going to have to, and if the pandemic didn't teach them anything, they're never going to learn it, be more focused on taking care of the needs of their employees before a disaster, before an incident. Post-incident, again, as I said earlier, there are people who have who had to go to a food bank during the pandemic because they lost their employment, people who had never been unemployed before, people who had families, who had children who had to eat. And, Feeding America and organizations like us stepped up to make sure that those folks that were facing food insecurity for the first time were taken care of. And we created in that realm a new army of disciples, people that believe in our mission and what we're doing because it's real. We feed people every day. Our CEO is fond of saying, not one drop of food comes out of 161 North Clark Street in Chicago. It all happens in the food banks, in the agencies that are actually going out there doing the work every day. But going back to your comments about farmers and ranchers and people who are now having to slaughter their cattle because they can't water them because of the drought, and people who are losing money. Again, those are some of the consequences of a lack of focus that we've had in this country over climate change and its effects. And now we're seeing that. We're seeing record flooding in places that never flooded before. And we're seeing tornadoes in Alabama in December. We're seeing, disasters of all kinds that are resulting from our lack of focus on the real things that could slow down the impacts of climate change. We can't stop it, but because that train has already left the station. But now people are starting to realize that we've created basically an enormous problem that we're now going to have to deal with. And so it's one of those pay me now or pay me later. And later has come for so many people because we're having all these disasters, and it's not going to get better. I would be less than honest if I sat here as a disaster manager and said that, well, all this is going to just get better and go away one day. No, it's not. It's going to get worse before it gets better.
Well, I could talk to you all day. I need to wrap this up, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your consulting firm that you've had for 10 years, Preparedness Matters, as well as your podcast. And I know you have several books out there, so wanted to give you a chance to share that with the audience as well. And any closing remarks you have. So thanks, Vince.
Well, thank you, Ashley, for having me on. So my Preparedness Matters organization, I actually started 10 years ago. Again, my intent was to have an entity separate from my day job where I could have a voice about the things that I'm most passionate about, which is, underserved communities and underserved populations. So I've done a lot of consulting work in that realm with organizations, community-based organizations. I continue to do that. Recently, the last year or so, spun off a podcast called Preparedness Matters with a partner of mine, Dane Neal, who's a radio host on WGN Radio, which is a super station out of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And our goal of the podcast was not to do another podcast about disasters and disaster preparedness, but to broaden the tent a little bit. And so our format is to talk to people who are not so much like you or I involved in the day-to-day issues of emergencies and disasters, but people who are outside of that realm, but do have experiences and do have ideas and do have things to share with the public, with the audience, again, to make disasters not such a mystery to people. For example, one of our first guests was Lieutenant Joe Kenda from the ID channel, Homicide Hunter. And Lieutenant Kenda, delightful guy, gave me some really good tips, gave our audience some really good tips on what to do in an active shooter situation.
Okay,
we, you know,
great.
we become more, you know, we become more, um, apathetic about those issues. But the reality is, again, active shootings can happen anywhere at any time. And so people have to know what to do. And it wasn't the traditional run, hide, fight that I thought it would be. He gave
Hmm.
some really good tips about what you need to do when you first hear gunfire.
Hmm.
And so we're trying to get guests on. We've had guests on from anywhere from sports to entertainment to and lots of emergency managers and lots of folks doing work in this space, but certainly trying to broaden the tent to make disasters and preparedness less mysterious and more mainstream to the people who need to know what they need to know. So we hope to provide that learning community where people can say, how did I know that, I should do this or should not do that? Well, I heard it on this podcast from some experts who were not necessarily experts in emergency management, but had experienced things that I too have experienced. So we're trying to do that. Working on a number of projects. I got my finger in a lot of things, as you might imagine, as always. But I'm just very, very grateful to be in this space and lots of wonderful people like yourself. Very, very smart and very dedicated people out there doing this work. And I just feel privileged to be able to work with them to help us better prepare our communities and our companies and our society for the inevitability of disasters and emergencies.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Vince. And I'll make sure that I'll link to everything that you've got going on down below. But where's the best place for people to connect with you if they want to learn more?
Sure. A couple of places. My website is www.preparednessmattersllc.com. You can find out more about me personally and professionally at Vince Davis, CEM, Certified Emergency Manager.com. And our podcast, you can find our podcast, Preparedness Matters, on Podbean and Spotify. We love to have you tune in. We've got some great episodes coming up for National Preparedness Month. Going to have some really great guests and discussions. But those are the places that you can reach out to me. We'd love to hear from your audience.